submit something to our meeting in the spring. As long as all goes to plan and we are kind of back to normal, we're going to have a spring meeting. And so it'll be in Rimouski. And if people are interested in that, we'll follow up at the end with information on how you can pursue that. So again, it's not an obligation. It's an option, an optional thing that we can tack on at the end. And there is some kind of support for students to attend that. So I'm happy to answer any of the questions about those things, but I don't want to take too much time now because I know Sydney's got a whole kind of 2 hours jam-packed for us. So I'm excited about that. So with that, I'll just say that we are not going to take a break either. We're just going to kind of roll right through because it's a 2-hour session. So if you need to step away for a second or whatever, feel free to do that at any time. Feel free to drop your cameras on or off, whatever is the most convenient or whatever you're comfortable with. So don't worry about that. We will be doing some breakout room stuff as we go, and we'll just roll with it as we need to. So I think those are all the things that I had to cover. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to officially kick it off and to pass over the camera to Sydney Millar, who is a knowledge mobilization consultant. And yeah, take it away, Sydney. Thank you so much for kicking this off for us.
Kyle, it's really exciting for me to be here today. Thanks for joining in. And it's really nice to see some familiar faces and names as well. And I'm really excited about joining you to talk about something that I'm really passionate about these days, which is moving research and knowledge into practice. I'm going to share my screen. Start. All right, how does that look? Everyone sees the PowerPoint slides? Kyle can give me a thumbs up. Perfect. All right. So here's an overview of what you can expect in the next 2 hours. And we'll start by talking about what is knowledge translation and discussing some of the key concepts and approaches. We'll also talk about why knowledge translation, or KT, is so important now. And then we're really going to dig into how we actually do KT. So as Kyle said, the next sessions in the KT Field School are really looking at specific knowledge mobilization tools or activities. And so my task today was to give you kind of a full overview of what, well, a high-level overview of what is KT, or knowledge mobilization, and give you some tools to help in the planning and implementation of KT activities. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So I've designed this workshop to walk you through the general steps of designing a KT plan. So thinking about key messages, thinking about primary, secondary, and influencer audiences. What are the barriers and facilitators for those audiences to knowledge use? Thinking about specific knowledge products and strategies or activities and how they relate to the needs of your audiences, thinking about dissemination and engagement, and then of course, always evaluation. So these steps, they're presented linearly, but they can be used at any time during the research process. At the beginning, as you're thinking about a funding application, for example, throughout the research process, as you engage key audiences, or at the end, once you have findings and are thinking about how they can best be leveraged to support change. And throughout these steps, I've built, as Kyle mentioned, I've built in large and small discussion groups to help you build your KT muscles and really help increase your knowledge, skill, and confidence to do this work in the future. And just one note, if you do have any questions as we go along, please make a note of them. And then I've built in a few spots where I will pause and ask if there's any questions, and I'll invite you to either add them to the chat then, or ideally unmute your mic and just ask away. If you do have any technical questions, the person to contact is Tammy Flood. You can use that chat box to ask her any questions that you might have. All right. So talking about what is KT, or knowledge translation, requires digging into some of the complexity of this field of work. So likely some of you have heard a number of different terms used to describe the process of moving research into practice. And that is a function of multiple fields, disciplines, and sectors doing this type of work. So for example, knowledge translation, or KT, is often used by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and in the medical and STEM fields. The term knowledge mobilization, or KMB is the acronym that's used, is used most often by SSHRC and the social science and humanities. And the term knowledge dissemination and engaged and exchange, for example, is used by some departments of the Canadian government. But in practice, these concepts aren't really significantly different. And I'd recommend that you be flexible with your terminology depending on with who or where or with whose funding you're working. And I typically use knowledge mobilization. So to avoid tripping over myself in the next couple of hours, I'm going to switch to the use of that language. So what is knowledge mobilization? So at its most basic, knowledge mobilization is about moving knowledge into action. It's intended to help empower people to use information in strategic ways to address real-life problems. So the ultimate goal is to improve people's lives, the communities or organizations or systems in which they live, work, and play. And more specifically, it's about taking the research or the latest evidence and using it to inform policy, programming, and practice. And we know that just because knowledge is available does not mean it gets used. The knowledge to action gap describes the discrepancy between what we know, the available evidence or knowledge, and what we do, our behavior or practice. The field of knowledge mobilization exists because it's not just enough to put knowledge out there into the world and expect people to magically pay attention. It takes time and effort to move new evidence and social innovations into broad practice. So for example, a 2011 paper famously found that only 14% of healthcare research is ever mobilized into practice. And this is research about, the most effective protocols for identifying cancer or treatment protocols. And moreover, such mobilization took an average of 17 years to be implemented. So that's a huge lag in terms of, when we know something and when we actually put it into practice. So to be effective, knowledge mobilization is getting the right information to the right people in the right format at the right time. So generally, effective knowledge mobilization is designed to achieve three key outcomes: to inform, to engage, and to act. Therefore, the tools and activities that you plan serve three basic functions. So an informational function, a relational function, and a systems and behavior change function. And you can think of this as a cyclical or stepwise process, with each function kind of building on the ones before. Information, relation, and systems and behavior change. So enabling dissemination and access to information is the most basic function of knowledge mobilization. The second function involves helping others to make sense of information, improving knowledge use and decision-making, and fostering co-production. The most complex function of knowledge mobilization is aimed at broad innovation and system change and builds on both the informational and relational functions. And examples of knowledge mobilization tools and activities that serve these outcomes or functions are all around us. So for example, academic publications and presentations are foundational examples of inform. So are training and resources developed for employers, unions, and employees in rural and remote communities to prevent and address domestic violence, for example. Example of knowledge mobilization tools and activities to engage knowledge users include networking groups for immigrant women living in rural communities, or tourism apps using geolocation technology to share local history and community stories. Examples of knowledge mobilization tools and activities to support system and behavioral change might include communities of practice to connect NGOs in OECD countries to share challenges and promising practices to rural development. Another example might be the co-production of tools with indigenous communities to understand and support the use of indigenous approaches to conservation. So I think it's important to consider why knowledge mobilization and why now. And I believe the time is now for up-and-coming researchers or future practitioners or policymakers, depending on where your next steps will lead you, to really embed knowledge mobilization in your practice. First, more and more researchers are committing to investing time and resources into effective knowledge mobilization practice. They want their research to be meaningful and get used or put into practice. They don't just want it left on the shelf. Second, funding agencies, including SSHRC and foundations such as the McConnell Family Foundation, are increasing expectations for knowledge mobilization beyond the typical academic publications and reports or token engagement of the community. And finally, organizations and leaders are looking for evidence to inform policy, programming, and practice to maximize the impact of their work. So this creates an opportunity for community-based research and knowledge mobilization that many didn't experience before. So it's possible to identify 4 general approaches to knowledge mobilization based on how knowledge is shared and used. So first is a push approach. And this model is colloquially known as, if you build it, they will come. Here, research knowledge is the catalyst for change. The push model assumes that knowledge users or your key audiences are motivated receivers of information and that they will actively seek out information. Therefore, the sole responsibility of the knowledge creators or researchers often is to push out their knowledge and make it accessible for whoever happens to need it. And most strategies in the push model focus on dissemination and are more focused on informing rather than engagement or system and behavior change. So second is a pull approach. And in this model, knowledge users are the main drivers of action. So this model puts the onus on the knowledge users to appraise and ask for the knowledge that they need. Therefore, the role of the knowledge creators is to reply, react, or respond to those requests from the knowledge users. And the pull model involves increasing levels of engagement from the knowledge users, as it often requires them to approach and engage with those knowledge creators. Third is the linkage or exchange approach. And this model assumes that both push and pull-based efforts have merit and should be really intertwined or interwoven. And this linkage and exchange model relies on partnerships where knowledge creators and knowledge users collaborate for mutual benefit. And this model may be short or long-term collaboration, and it may occur at any point in the research policy process. It could include activities such as priority setting exercises, collaborative research projects, or projects with a developmental product at the end. And this model, as this model relies on partnerships, engagement is essential. The last approach is an intermediary or institutional approach. And in this model, typically national or regional level institutions or organizations foster linkages and exchange across sectors and individuals to support knowledge mobilization. So these intermediary organizations or knowledge broker type organizations may house resources, evidence, data, and personnel with those knowledge brokering skills. And this may be thought as an organization or systems level linkage and exchange strategy. And for example, the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation is a great example of this type of approach. You may also want to categorize your approach in relation to the point at which knowledge mobilization occurs in your project. So 2 broad categories of knowledge mobilization that you will hear frequently discussed are end of project or integrated knowledge mobilization. So end of product End of project knowledge mobilization or end of grant knowledge mobilization focuses largely on mobilizing research, literature, or evidence that has already been conducted. So this focuses mostly on the push model that we discussed before. And typical outcomes of this type of knowledge mobilization include passive dissemination and communication activities, but may also include more intensive dissemination and implementation activities, such as small group educational sessions. Frequently, end of product knowledge mobilization involves the development and implementation of a plan for making knowledge users aware of the final results. In contrast, integrated knowledge mobilization focuses on collaboration and/or participatory approaches. The aim of integrated knowledge mobilization is to engage knowledge users and/or other relevant stakeholders in the research process, often before it even begins. And the main idea is that if knowledge users are involved with the research, it will be more solutions focused and more likely to yield results relevant to the user's decision-making needs. So in integrated knowledge mobilization, key audiences are often engaged throughout the research process. So each of these steps provides an opportunity for engagement and collaboration, from defining the research questions to providing insight and context to help interpret results, to taking the lead on knowledge mobilizations to share with their own stakeholders or audience groups. So it's time for all of you to start talking and get warmed up and engaged for the rest of the session. And so what I'd like to do to start us off is a large group brainstorm about different tools, products, activities, events, etc. that can be used to mobilize knowledge. And I want to reassure everyone on the workshop today that I'm not expecting you to be knowledge mobilization experts. The workshop today is designed to give you a taste of the knowledge mobilization planning process and get the juices flowing for the type of tools and activities you could integrate into your own research or other types of work. So don't be afraid to actively engage. There's no wrong answers, and I hope everyone signed in today with a growth mind. Everyone should see my Jamboard now. Kyle, give me the thumbs up if that's the case. So if you haven't used Jamboard, it's super easy once you get all those permissions figured out. So what I want you to do during our brainstorm is just to add sticky notes with ideas about different tools, products, activities, events, etc. Anything that you think can be used to mobilize knowledge. And so, for example, what I'd invite you to do is bring your cursor over to the left hand of the screen, and there's a sticky note feature. All you have to do is click on it, add an innovative idea or boring idea, whatever you want, such as a podcast, more on the innovative side of things. Click save, and then you will have that posted on the screen. And then you can move it around, you can add your own, you can keep going. So I'm going to invite you to go to Jamboard, and I'll give you about 5 minutes. We can do a large group brainstorm on various ideas. And as you'll see, some of the sticky notes are lining up on top of each other. So just make sure you move them around so that we're not blocking any. All right. And let Tammy know if you have any issues there. And Tammy, you can pause the recording if you want. All right. That is not going to be very efficient if I have to advance through all my slides every time. All right, so Great job. As I said, come on back to Zoom if you're not there already. Kyle, you can see my PowerPoint presentation. Thank you. All right, so let's do a little debrief on how that brainstorm went. So using the reaction features in Zoom, how many of you were surprised by the number of knowledge mobilization tools or activities, or saw tools and activities that you were unfamiliar with? Anyone? Nodding. I see some nods. That's nice. Some thumbs up. Perfect. So on this slide, I've captured just a few knowledge mobilization tools and activities, but I've categorized them under the 3 functions we discussed earlier, relating to the outcomes of inform, engage, and act. And one of the first tools I want to share with you, well, the second, because we talked about the 1-3-25 approach to reports. So the second tool I want to share with you is a Google Doc that lists more than 150 knowledge mobilization tools and activities. And so that I don't have to, I'm going to share that after so that I don't lose where I am on these slides. And I want to thank, and so again, that document, I'll share it with you. It's on Google Drive, 150 different types of knowledge mobilization tools and activities. And Travis Zanart, who's a knowledge mobilization specialist at Frame, which is a national nonprofit addressing youth mental health and addiction, I want to thank him for pulling together the foundation for that piece. So I will share that momentarily. And I definitely recommend that you bookmark that document when you get it to save it for future reference. And it'll be also be included in the copy of the PowerPoint slides shared after this event. So before we move on to going through the various steps to knowledge mobilization, are there any questions that anyone wants to ask? Either if you have any questions, Tammy, I don't know if anything's coming up in the chat that I want me to address, or if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask away.
Yeah, the only question so far was just if the presentation was going to be shared afterwards. And I mentioned that sending out a toolkit for everyone after the presentation.
Great, thank you. All right, we shall move along. So in my consulting practice, I work with researchers to promote a more intentional approach to knowledge mobilization. And so knowledge mobilization is not just about what is trendy or easy. To be most effective, you need to consider your key messages, your priority audiences or knowledge users, and then match those to specific tools and activities. And so for the next however many minutes, hour and a half, we're going to walk through these steps to give you the basics of what's involved. And these steps, again, as I mentioned, the steps are often presented linearly, but in practice, they're more iterative. So for example, once you define your audiences and understand their barriers, you may need to go back and refine your key messages. So let's dive in. So step 1 is focused on refining those key messages. So for some, this is the hardest and longest process of the knowledge mobilization planning process. The reality is most knowledge mobilization tools and activities will only capture and disseminate a very narrow slice of your research and results. So to support the distillation process, you need to start with the so what of your research findings. What is the important outcome and what's the call to action for the audiences? You need to consider why people should care. You need to draft goals and objectives that capture the impact that you want to have, because often impact follows process and intention. And then consider how messages can be matched with audiences and tools for the biggest impact. And so for those of you who are graduate students, you'll be thinking about your 100 to 300 page thesis or dissertation and how to mobilize the findings. And I challenge you to start distilling the so what of your research down to 1 page, maybe a paragraph, maybe 1 line, or even just a few words. What is the key message? So I want to share an example. I was working on a plan to mobilize important research about concussions. And the research found that 43.5% of concussion patients were returning to sport too soon. So this was for a variety of reasons, including pressure from teammates, coaches, and even parents. And so to refine my message, I really had to think about so what and the type of outcome that I wanted to get. So whether informational, relational, or behavioral change. And eventually I distilled the research down to a key message focused on respecting recovery. The message was developed for coaches as the primary audience because they often have the positional power to enforce concussion protocols and determine whether or not an athlete takes to the field, court, pool, ice, whatever. So these messages were integrated into a point of decision-making poster series to provide on-site reminders for coaches to pause and assess the situation before giving an athlete the green light. So again, in this example, we went from, incidents of returning to sport too soon, all the different factors about why athletes are making that decision, and narrowed it down to 2 words: respect, recovery. So the second step in the knowledge mobilization planning process is defining the key audiences. And like the overabundance of terms to refer to the process of putting knowledge into practice, there are also a number of terms people use to describe audiences. So these include target audience, knowledge user, end user, and stakeholder. Regardless of your terminology, when you're planning knowledge mobilization, you want to carefully consider your strategic audiences. And so there are 5 general types of audiences: researchers and research administrators, policymakers, service providers or organizations, the community or general public, and individuals. But within these groups, it's really important to drill down and be specific. For example, if you want to influence government policymakers, you have to consider what level of government you want to reach. Is it community or municipal? Is it provincial, territorial, national, international? Maybe you're reaching out to Indigenous self-governing bodies. You also have to consider what department should be engaged, and whether you want to engage elected officials or public servants. So an audience mapping exercise can help you identify the possible audiences for your research, but inevitably you'll need to prioritize. So determine your primary and secondary audiences, consider your initial key messages and goals and objectives, and think about what groups need to know, which groups are ready to act, for example, or which can influence the most change. For example, the coaches in my example earlier. You might also want to consider influencers. Yes, these could include social media influencers, but other examples can include regulating bodies, religious or cultural groups, or city council members, for example, assuming these aren't already on your list of primary or secondary audiences. And you could also consider any unintended audiences, thinking about who else might be listening and who might affect the outcomes of your knowledge mobilization plan. So I'll go back for a second. So depending on the project, sometimes you might have a lot of distinct audiences. Sometimes you might only have 1 or 2 really specific audiences. And doing this type of audience mapping can really be useful to deepen your understanding of the area you're working in, or can even lead to subsequent research projects. And one thing I definitely recommend is to share the audience mapping with any stakeholders you're collaborating with or any partners, because there might be some that you missed and some that you didn't consider that others might be familiar with. So we're going to go to another brainstorm. And so in a minute, I'll invite you to return to Jamboard, and you can access that new link that I sent. And for the rest of the large and small group sessions, we're going to focus on the intentionally broad issue of rural health, promoting or improving rural health and well-being. And we've left it broad intentionally so that the topic can be of service to as many of you as possible. And so for this brainstorm, I invite you to again take 5 minutes to brainstorm as many audiences as possible for this topic. I do recommend you consider the topic from multiple perspectives, such as economic development, infrastructure, health promotion, community building. I also want to remind you to drill down and be specific with the audiences that you're identifying. And definitely feel free to build off others' ideas. So I'm going to invite you to go to Jamboard now and start your brainstorming. And you can go to Jamboard number 2 to brainstorm there. And Tammy, I think if you keep the recording on, you can watch all of the population happening on Jamboard. All right, we've got lots of things already. So my recommendation for this activity is not to take rural health too literally, to focus just on physical health. Think also about economic health, for example, and sustainability, long-term sustainability of the communities. So who else might want to be involved from those perspectives? Some great diversity now coming in. Great. I'll give you 1 more minute. All right. So as the last examples are coming in, any thoughts, reactions from anyone? Were you surprised by the diversity of audiences or the inclusion of some specific examples? Anything anyone wants to share? Or any gaps that you notice? Feel free to unmute and share.
Sydney, I'll jump in.
Yes, Simon.
Just in general, I think how it can be naive to think when you break down a particular context, whether it's rural context, maybe a sport context, whatever. But then when you actually have a bunch of minds coming together and thinking through all the different organizations or all the different stakeholders, it can quite quickly blossom into what we're seeing on the screen, which is a nice reminder.
Absolutely. And I think it really reinforces a lot of the issues that we're dealing with and that you're all dealing with in your studies are really complex system issues. And it's complicated and it's messy. There's lots of stakeholders. But, you know, then we have to prioritize. So, you know, no one has the capacity to deal with all of these. So really that intentional approach really begs us to prioritize what we want to do. So yeah, and to Simon, to your point, you know, making sure that you're asking for a second or third opinion once you do an activity like this is really important to notice any gaps or biases in your thinking. And doing a map like this, you know, it could be as easy as saying, okay, I'm going to do it by myself. I'm going to spend 10 minutes and brainstorm as many as I can. You can also do it in a much more structured approach and not only identify the audiences, but then start to map kind of the linkages and the relationships between them, the power dynamics, who has resources, who doesn't, all those types of things. So this type of map can be as simple or as complex as is valuable.
We did just have one comment in the chat from Jake. The church, he said the church surprised me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if that's not something, yeah, if that's not a practice that you have, then it may not be on your radar, but certainly for a lot of people, it's an important place of community, sharing information, and yeah, building that community. So we should be back to my PowerPoint presentation. And so the third step in this process is looking at the barriers and facilitators for those various audience groups. An effective knowledge mobilization is really user-centered, which means it should be developed based on the preferences and needs of those target audiences. So generally, there are 4 main barriers to knowledge use or reasons for the knowledge to action gap. So knowledge gaps occur when intended users of knowledge, they don't know that the information exists or what action to take. They don't understand the information, what it means or why it's important. They may not care about the information, seeing it as irrelevant or not beneficial to their own agendas or mandates. Or finally, they may not agree with the implications of the information or research, believing the knowledge to be misguided or false. So effective and successful knowledge mobilization has to overcome these barriers. Moreover, each type of barrier must be addressed on its own terms. So, for example, if your audience only lacks knowledge or information and is waiting with open arms for the evidence you have to share, then enabling action could be as easy and straightforward as creating and disseminating knowledge products. If your audience doesn't understand the evidence, you may need to make sure that your knowledge is clear and credible. Success could depend on plain language writing or ensuring products are put in the context of the primary audience. If your audience doesn't care about the research, you'll have to work hard to make sure your knowledge mobilization is relevant. This could mean aligning your knowledge with your audience's agenda. And finally, if your audience doesn't believe your evidence, you'll need to invest more time in making your knowledge mobilization compelling and probably collaborating with individuals or organizations to increase the credibility and trust amongst your target audiences. Oh, sorry, missed one. So the theoretical domains framework is another tool you can use to identify and describe the barriers and facilitators to knowledge use, focusing on individual capability, motivation, and opportunity to act. So this is a descriptive framework that synthesizes diverse theories of behavior change. So for example, when considering an audience's capability to act, you need to consider if they have the necessary physical and psychological skills, competencies, and knowledge. When considering an audience's motivation to act, you need to consider their social or positional power, their personal and professional identity, their beliefs around consequences of action or inaction, and available reinforcement. So for example, do they get a certification through a training event or recognition from a professional association? And finally, when considering an audience's opportunity to act, you need to consider their environmental context and resources. So for example, those within their household or community or organization, as well as their social influences. So what are their family, friends, or colleagues doing? So a next step for larger knowledge mobilization plans is to develop personas for key audience groups. And a persona is a fictional character that helps you conceptualize the goals and behavior of your audience. They're developed by answering questions about a typical person in your target audiences, such as the nature of their work, their values, their go-to sources of knowledge, key challenges in using knowledge, and how your knowledge mobilization products or activities can help them solve their problems. So another brainstorm. And so for this brainstorm, we're going to divide you randomly into 4 small groups. And each group is going to discuss the barriers and facilitators to knowledge use for specific audiences. So within your small groups, I want you to discuss the barriers and facilitators and use the Jamboard more like a flip chart. So I want you to, start off and put you in your small groups, introduce yourselves, and have a facilitated conversation using the populating the Jamboard through that discussion rather than silent adding of sticky notes. So I'll give you about 10 minutes for this conversation. And at 2 minutes, I'll invite each group to consider the top considerations that should inform their knowledge mobilization plan. And then I'll need, just to warn you, I'll need 1 volunteer from each group to share the highlights from that discussion with the larger group. And so there's 4 groups, and group 1 is provincial territorial policymakers. Group 2 is community-based organizations. Group 3 is small business owners, and group 4 are adolescents. I'm going to come out of this, sharing my screen, and put that in the chat box in case you get lost. And of course, the link to the Jamboard. All right. That was a great discussion. So I'm going to talk about the next 2 steps. Step 4, knowledge mobilization tools and activities, and step 5, dissemination and engagement together before sending you off again into small group for one last small group activity. So all right, so step 4 revisits the conversation that we started earlier about the tools and activities used for knowledge mobilization. And if you haven't noticed already, I pasted that, that Google Doc with all of the 150 tools and activities into the chat box for you to access. So in the past, most researchers spent little time doing knowledge mobilization, believing it wasn't their role or trusting that people looking for information would find it. But the if I publish, they will come mentality has been proven ineffective. If knowledge mobilization doesn't happen, knowledge will sit on the shelf or in a journal. So we need to use tools and strategies that make knowledge easy to access, understand, apply, and use. So we need to consider what's appropriate for the key messages and the target audiences. So the best approach to identifying effective knowledge mobilization tools and activities is a combination of understanding your audiences, which is easier now, having just gone through that practice of considering the barriers and facilitators. It's about integrating ideas and evidence from the literature, and some tools and activities are evidence-based, and some evidence exists about effective approaches to use with specific audiences, such as there's a fair amount of literature available about how to best engage policymakers. It's also about calling on knowledge of what doesn't work. So this might come from experience that you've had or insight from your partners. And it's also about careful thought testing to challenge assumptions and pressure test your process. So this could be, a really formal process, or it could be informal consultation, such as a coffee shop with someone, a coffee chat with someone within the audience group. So, and if you have time or money, you can also throw in a really formal pilot test to further refine your tools and strategies. However, creating the best infographic or snazzy whiteboard video isn't going to matter if no one sees it. And designing the most amazing workshop isn't going to matter if no one shows up to participate. So step 5 focuses on dissemination and engagement. So there are, of course, numerous strategies you can use for dissemination and engagement. So I want to focus on just a few key recommendations or considerations. So one is to re-engage your research participants. So sharing any knowledge mobilization tools and activities with your research participants is critical to honoring their time and contribution to your project. Plus, they already have a vested interest in the project, so could be great champions for disseminating the knowledge. It's also important to understand the relevant communications landscape. So do your homework to understand how your key audiences communicate. What are the key newsletters, forums, or conferences they attend? And use those as the basis for your dissemination and engagement strategies. It's also really valuable to collaborate with key organizations. Partners can provide insight to help you refine your dissemination and engagement plans. They can help spread the word by providing access to sector communication tools, co-hosting events, or giving your research other types of profile. Partners and sponsors can also help increase credibility, which can be positive during the early times of your career, for example, or an important differentiator for even the most seasoned researchers. 4 is about harnessing the power of social media and thinking about what are the audiences on each platform, being strategic with the use of handles and hashtags to grow your network and reach. If you're using your personal account and you only have 10 followers, it might not be that effective. Using strategies to engage rather than just broadcast out on social media. But also being aware of the limitations. So who isn't on these platforms, what privacy concerns exist, and then also you're thinking about your target audience and whether they use it for personal or professional use, and which of their own identities you're trying to engage and whether that's appropriate. And finally, using a layered approach. And I want to spend a bit more time talking about this. So using a layered approach is an important consideration for step 4, considering knowledge mobilization tools and strategies, as well as about dissemination and engagement. And too often I've heard academics who fall into the trap of one and done thinking. So if you have different primary audiences, then likely you're going to need multiple knowledge mobilization products. You're also going to need a plan to disseminate activities using multiple methods over a period of time. And remember, what's old news to you, you think, oh, I published that 2 months ago, it's old news, maybe brand new to someone else. And so it's really important to have these longer term strategies. And I'm going to share just one example of a layered knowledge mobilization strategy. And so this, the first one is from CIRC, which is the Sport Information Resource Center that does knowledge mobilization from researchers into the Canadian sports sector. And in my role as the manager of content strategy, I would connect with researcher after reading about their published research and collaborate with them to share their findings with the Canadian sports sector. And so from one academic journal article, we would create plain language articles and blogs, and also short knowledge nuggets that linked back to those pieces. We would share these products through our newsletter and on social media, and we would provide opportunities for the researchers to present at conferences and record and post those sessions for later dissemination or viewing. And all of this would happen over a period of 6 to 12 months. And so this, for example, is an example of a push approach to knowledge mobilization. So just sending it out in broadcast style. So with that knowledge, I'm going to send you back again to your small groups. So there's 2 tasks with this. The first is to build on your knowledge about the barriers and facilitators to knowledge use for your target audience, and think about which knowledge mobilization tools or activities would be appropriate for your audience. And then I want you to identify 3, maybe we'll do 2 of those. So identify 2 that you think these are the go-to strategies for this audience. And step 2, I want you to think about how do you disseminate those strategies or engage your audience in those strategies to ensure they get into the hands of the right people. And so again, I want you to discuss as a small group, but capture your notes on Jamboard. And of course, one of you will be voluntold to report back. All right, so I think you've all seen in the Jamboard, you already have a new Jamboard queued up with those 2 questions. So I will invite Tammy to return everyone to their small groups. And you'll have maybe 10 or 15 minutes, depending on the clock, when I get to see it.
Did you want me to pause the recording?
Yeah, you can pause it. Okay, you can see the Jamboard from my computer. Okay, perfect. Is everyone back yet, Tammy, or are we still waiting? They're back? All right, so which group wants to go first? Any volunteers?
I can go first since you're already on our slide.
Great. And so, yeah, if you want to just share kind of what you think maybe that those 2 top tools or activities you would use to engage your audience, and then how you would make sure that they actually engage in those tools or activities. That'd be great.
Yeah, so we were group for adolescents. And so we talked about a lot of different things, as you can see on the Jamboard. But we wanted to highlight more of like a layered approach, particularly centered around accessing youth and adolescents in their school settings. So trying to reach this population, not only defaulting on like online platforms, because we also understand that some youth may not have access to those tools or what have you. So focusing on the school, and then having like follow-up online pieces, blogs, short little videos on social media and things like that to supplement like more of a school-based presentation or interactive activity. And then in terms of like actually being able to make that happen, we talked about the importance of relationship building with gatekeepers for youth and adolescents, particularly parents and like the school board, like the institutions that could potentially limit access. So in addition to talking to the youth, we also talked about having like parent-focused sessions as well, to really tie like whatever message we're trying to get across into different important stakeholder groups.
Yeah, great. Anything else to add from other group 4 members or from the rest of the participants from the other groups? All right. I think that notion of who those gatekeepers are is really important and kind of links to that audience group of influencers when you're thinking about it that way. All right, which group wants to go next? Any volunteers?
We can go next.
Okay, Erin, remind me what group you are?
We're group 2, community-based organizations.
Great. All right. So again, just focus on your 2 top tools and activities and how you'd get them out to the community-based organizations.
Yeah, so our first one was creating summaries of the research, some kind of, thing done in plain language, and then disseminate that to whatever the applicable community organization would be. And then how we would get that to the organization is tap into maybe things that they already have, like maybe they have a newsletter or a blog or, a listserv of emails or websites or whatever. And then that can then further be disseminated to their membership. And then our next one was maybe hosting some form of a community-based workshop or talk or something along those lines. And then in terms of dissemination, we thought that since these are, organizations that might typically be strapped for time or volunteer run or things along those lines, that we'd maybe want to meet in a space where they're already planning on meeting. So maybe an AGM meeting or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And those are our main ones.
Yeah, that suggestion to build on an existing meeting is really a good one, I think. Any other thoughts from other group 2 members or any of the members of other groups on engaging community-based organizations? All right, so who wants to go next? Group 1 or 3? Okay, I'm going to volunteer group 1. All right, so group 1, provincial territorial policymakers. So again, what are your top 2 tools and activities, and how are you going to make sure they get taken up?
Hello, I was nominated as speaker. Anyway, I think we were a bit confused about this area at first, so we didn't get too far in. We were sort of discussing a lot about how the provincial/territorial was throwing us off, because in like the territorial context, if you wanted to go to like a local newspaper, that might work to get the policymakers' attention, because depending on where you are, like if you're in Iqaluit or Yellowknife, policymakers might live and work there already, so they'll read the newspaper, versus like Ontario or Quebec, where there's a lot more people and it's a lot more spread out. So I think we decided that an executive summary or a report of some sort would probably be the best for all of them, or partnering with some sort of local organization to sort of get the word out there and sort of get more media attention from a broader geographical span, I guess, would be a more all-encompassing idea. Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty much all we got.
Perfect. Yeah, and it is interesting, your point about, you really have to understand the context of these policymakers, and there is big differences across the country in terms of how you can engage them. But newspaper articles could be, still an effective strategy if, for example, you're criticizing the current government in an op-ed, for example. That could be an effective way to influence elected officials, for example. But definitely, I think the research would say that having research briefs or executive summaries of research is one of the top ways to engage policymakers, for sure. That's the world they live in, right? All right. I'm going to go to group 3, who was talking about small business owners. Who's going to present?
I don't know if we decided on a presenter this time, but I can do it if my team's okay with that. Our top 2 strategies we were discussing were kind of a social media targeted strategy. We feel like that's a really important avenue that small business users usually have to promote their business. And another really important one we were talking about, similar to group 2, is building on or like working with already existing community groups or community meetings that might have been happening. And to make sure these things are successful within those community groups, if you're leading, say, like a workshop, or you're trying to educate and have like a knowledge leader within that, we were talking a lot about like incentives or tangible outcomes for small business owners to have, whether that be like a workshop they can have up on, like a certificate they can have up on the wall, or something that they've participated in this workshop. Kind of something for them to take away from. And then also we were talking about the importance of kind of engaging key stakeholders within these processes, so that when you have like small business owners, who they're listening to and who are the key people they're getting information from, if you're engaging with these people and kind of like creating strategic partnerships, that can help to push along that information, whether through social media or through the workshops you're hosting.
Yeah, for sure. Any other pressing thoughts from anyone on this activity that anyone wants to share? All right, I will switch over to my PowerPoint. We've just got a few more slides to go. So step 6 is all about evaluation, which is a world that all of you are living in various ways right now. So I wanted to spend, before we wrap up, I wanted to spend a bit of time on this last but no less important step in the knowledge mobilization process, to consider how you evaluate these types of knowledge mobilization efforts. Okay. So evaluation plans can include both process or outcome or impact evaluations, and process evaluation can include measures of implementation. For example, were the knowledge mobilization tools or activities delivered as planned? Process evaluation can look at research or engagement. So how many members of the primary audience were reached, as well as satisfaction. So did the audience like the tool or event? Did it meet their expectations? But given the goal of knowledge mobilization is to move research into action and improve policy, programming, and practice, outcome or impact evaluation may be more valuable to knowing if you're successful. So this could include different measures of changes in individual awareness, knowledge, and behavior, as well as changes in organization or system policy, programming, and practice. So depending on the timelines and resources, an evaluation of your knowledge mobilization tools and activities could be formal or informal, and could include both qualitative or quantitative methods. And when you're thinking about this and thinking about what types of activities you might want to include in an evaluation, really hone in on what do you need to know. Evaluating your knowledge mobilization activities could be another full research project, but it's likely just a very small part of what you're doing. So it's really important to scale accordingly. All right. So really quickly, maybe 1 minute, using the chat box, what are the types of methods that you could use for a process or outcome evaluation? Any ideas? Kyle says reads. Other ideas? What about surveys? What about polls? Some type of questionnaire before and after implementation. Surveys, social media analytics, absolutely. Other ideas? What about looking at impact? So you could do pre and post surveys that measure outcomes in terms of, did participants increase their knowledge or their intention to act, for example. Doing audits is a great way to do it, making sure that people are implementing and using the practices and policies that they should. So there's all kinds of, obviously all kinds of methods, and, you know, again, it's just about you being really strategic with this and thinking about what do you and your audience have capacity for. All right. So a few final thoughts. I hope that my walk through the 6 steps to effective knowledge mobilization was valuable, and that you feel like you improved your skills and confidence to do knowledge mobilization in the future. And so I wanted to share a few final thoughts or key takeaways from the session. So just a reminder to always stay user-centered and really invest the time to map your audiences, understand their barriers and facilitators to knowledge use, and develop tools and activities that make knowledge easy to access, understand, apply, and use. It's also really important to think outside the box and don't just use a tool because it's the way it's always been done. Don't be afraid to try something new that you think might work to really capture that audience's interest in different ways. Really important, I can't emphasize enough the importance and the value of collaboration as researchers working and doing community-based research. It's effective for more effective knowledge mobilization, knowing and understanding what they want and using their insight. It really helps increase your credibility as a researcher doing that type of work, and also can support future projects. And always remember to scale your knowledge mobilization plans based on time, budget, and capacity, both yours and your partners. So I wanted to let you know that I have included a list of the recommended resources from the piece in the PowerPoint slides. So we'll make sure that you get those out to you. And so the menu of knowledge mobilization tools I shared with you, that's that 150 pieces. The knowledge mobilization planning toolkit is something that walks you through a process like we did today with 5 different steps about how to plan and implement knowledge mobilization practices. One thing I'll draw your attention to is a plain language writing checklist. We talked about that in a lot of the group discussions, and making sure that knowledge is really delivered in ways that different audiences can easily understand it. And I want to do a plug for a certificate in knowledge mobilization. So this is one of many different types of courses at different universities in Canada. And this one is one that I took that I thought was really great. So if this is an area of interest, then I definitely recommend checking it out. So that's it. I do have a very quick evaluation if you have time. That would be great to telling me about the session. And if you can stay and you have any questions, I would love to continue to chat and answer any questions that you have. And with that, I will turn it over to Kyle.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I don't have much to say other than just a huge thank you for your time to pull this together and really kick us off. Set a really strong foundation for how we think about these things. Moving forward, I think we're going to get more into these kind of nitty gritty or different ways of doing things. But I think this was an excellent way to kind of set the tone and think big picture strategically about knowledge translation mobilization and what that can look like. So amazing way to kick off this our little field school here. So thank you so much, Sydney. And I will then just leave it open if people have questions or want to ask things. Sydney is there, and I'll hang up for a bit too if people have questions for me or Tanny.
Yeah, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sydney. Great presentation.
Thanks, Megan.